verdict reversing President Trump's tariffs. I'm now joined by a panel of experts. We have Patkrit Payne with us, geopolitical expert. We're also joined by Josh Koren, founder and CIO at Musketeer Capital Partners, as well as Gaura Sen-Gupta, chief economist at IDFC First Bank. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Patkrit, if I could come to you first. What does the Supreme Court ruling essentially mean for that India-US trade deal, proposed as it may be, but does it now run the risk of perhaps turning towards the side of being redundant? Does it give India a lot more negotiating room in terms of its bilateral relations with the US insofar as trade is concerned? And is it a clear and present win, firstly, for the Indian industry? What do you make of the Supreme Court ruling at the get-go?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, let's understand what the Supreme Court said. Supreme Court of United States said that the specific act under which he was imposing these tariffs, International Emergency Economic Powers Act, he cannot use it indiscriminately. And that if he has to impose tariffs, he would have to take US congressional approvals. Now, congressional approvals for all kinds of tariffs, he cannot take. He will certainly not want to take. So I think when it comes to the Indo-US trade agreement, as of yet, what appears that the trade, tariff rate will be something around 10%. It does give India the power or concession to extract more concessions. Secondly, what's important is that the way US administration has been imposing tariffs, additional tariffs on anybody buying Russian oil, I do not know whether they can anymore use that or not. And if they cannot use that anymore, then it's not just India, many other countries will start procuring more oil from Russia, primarily because they have not imposed sanctions on the Russian oil per se. They have imposed sanctions on specifically two companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. See, the problem with the whole issue of tariff is that they have tried to weaponize the tariff and use it as a sanction kind of a tool, which I think is not just impacting trade, but it is impacting the American consumers primarily. The reason is this. You know, when a tariff is imposed, it is not that the countries who are exporting to United States, they are paying the tariff. The tariff is paid at the end of the day by the US consumers. So the bigger issue is this, that you would have large number of litigations coming up in the next few months, possibly for $175 billion potentially refund. The other issue is that if there is a 10% standard tariff that which is now imposed for all the countries, as has been mentioned, then the validity of that is merely 5 months. After 5 months, they have to be renewed under the US Trade Power 1974. And then the midterm elections come where inevitably the possibility of the Trump administration or the Republicans losing some more seats goes up. And in that kind of a scenario, the bargaining power of Trump administration itself or imposing these tariffs will be even lesser. So all in all, I think the problem with this is lack of uniformity, more of arbitrary and indiscretionary or indiscriminate use of tariff as a weapon, and then overall trade deals. So if you look at what is happening right now, I think India will go ahead with the trade deal.
No, absolutely,
but the European Union trade deal looks better.
The possibility of litigation, of course, is no doubt bearing heavily on the Supreme Court ruling itself. But Josh, if I could just bring you in on this. Sure, there's all that talk about a possible refund, $175 billion, whether there's precedent for it, how challenging will it be? But I think the bigger question that we must be asking here is, could there be a backdoor re-entry of sorts insofar as these tariffs are concerned? Could President Trump, for instance, use the national security angle so as to ensure that a large chunk of these tariffs that he intended to impose, which were in effect before being overruled by the Supreme Court itself, could they make a re-entry of sorts under a different section? And could the uncertainty surrounding that be a potential problem for the industry at large? Josh?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it. And I definitely think that's possible. I mean, they're already talking about different solutions. So whether it's the 10% blanket tariff, or he's also mentioned that he's advised his administration to just do probes into all the U.S. major trading partners to just find holes kind of wherever they can. All of these different ways or angles that he can still enact this tariff even without congressional approval, or he's certainly going to try to do so. So I think that while the Supreme Court shot down the use of tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Act, like has already been mentioned, it's probable that Trump find ways to circumvent Congress and get something done because that's just such a hallmark of his whole administration's mantra. It's unlikely, at least to me, that he will drop it.
Absolutely, and thank you for breaking that down in terms of how it can progress from here on. Gaurav, quickly bring you back into the discussion itself. What becomes of Indian trade at this time and place? Let's say a sector like textiles, cut and polished diamonds, heavily impacted by way of the tariffs itself. Seeing trade, in fact, drop down to 16% since the dropped down by 16% since the imposition of the tariffs. Is there some semblance of relief here, or do you feel the uncertainty could only complicate matters for sectors like these?
There'll be some uncertainty. So, for example, for the next few months, I think we'll definitely have a 10% bilateral tariff rather than the previous. For now, the trade deal was yet to be signed. So, we've had effectively 25% tariffs, which would have been in effect. If we had signed the trade deal, it would have come down to an 18% that is facing gems and jewelry and textiles. So, in the near term, there is more uncertainty, but I think it's positive because for the next few months, we'll be facing 10% bilateral tariffs, which is lower than the agreed 18%. I think the most important part of the Supreme Court ruling is that President Trump can no longer use the Emergency Power Act to basically use tariffs as a tool. And that was not just a tool for trade negotiations, it was a tool that was getting used for a variety of reasons. It was not just trade related. So they have removed that power from him. So going forward in the remainder of his presidency, you will see that his ability to wield tariffs as a sort of a punitive action on other countries to get them to agree to, let's say, trade and non-trade related actions will be much, much lesser. So you will see a far lesser bargaining chip that the US government has. It also, so from that perspective, it's good news. It's good news not just for India, it's good news for all countries, all emerging markets. You will see a US government that will be less blatant in its utilization of tariffs. From a India specific, you can see maybe for the next few months there could be some front loading of exports while we are enjoying this temporary 10% bilateral tariff. I do expect that India will ultimately sign a trade deal with the US and we will get to that 18%, though the bargaining power of US is now much weaker. But as the other panelists said, there are other legal acts under which the US can put country-specific tariffs. For example, there is a Fair Trade Practices section under which they can initiate country-specific investigations and put an additional tariff, which is likely what they're going to do. So sooner or later, you will end up again having to face those higher levels of bilateral tariffs. They'll come via other means. It'll take some time. So from a certainty perspective, from ensuring that trade relationships with the US don't worsen further, it still makes sense to go ahead with the trade deal. Maybe the bargaining power of India is a little more now, and I'm not sure whether the government will want to take advantage of that. But yes, it is a good news. You will see a far less blatant utilization of tariffs by the US government because of the Supreme Court ruling. In the near term, you can see some pickup in exports from all the affected sectors to the US, some sort of front loading, which we actually saw ahead of the 50% bilateral tariffs. There was a surge of exports that went to the US ahead of those tariffs. We could see some similar pattern during this next few months when we are enjoying this 10% bilateral tariff.
Absolutely. Gaurav, like you said, I think make hay while the sun shines would pretty much be the approach that most exporters take given the legal intervention on this front, especially given the significance of the legal and economic event that has taken place by way of the 6-3 ruling. I also think you make a rather important point when you talk about simply the way that the Supreme Court has made it amply clear that the congressional route is perhaps the only route that President Trump can take should he decide to invoke these, these extraordinary powers or these emergency powers that he has used by way of imposing the tariff. So, Pathakrit, if I could come back to you very quickly, let's talk about that $175 billion tariff tally of sorts that the US has racked up by way of the reciprocal tariff since 2025. is there legal precedent in terms of a refund? The United States side has spoken in its Supreme Court hearing that doing that would be perhaps a very difficult prospect, but the legal route to claim a refund is always there, given the fact that the tariffs never stood legal muster in the first place. So how viable and how realistic is a possible refund of these tariffs that have already been paid to the US?
It's going to be, will open up a can of worms, because eventually it is American consumers who have paid the money, so they will be looking for the refund. Secondly, whether legal precedence of refund is there, yes, there are legal precedents of refund, but there is no legal precedence of this kind of an arbitrary use of tariffs. See, the bigger issue why the Supreme Court verdict is important is look at the way the Trump administration has threatened countries with even 200% tariff. That is not something they can do anymore. Eventually, you'll see it may potentially have probably hundreds of thousands of litigation. Somebody who even bought something worth say $500 from a departmental store in the United States might then go and claim that, look, I paid 50% tariff on it because you imposed 50% tariff. This was illegal because this could not have been used as a normalized tool for imposing tariffs, so I want a refund. It would have hundreds and thousands of such cases come up. For United States, it's not going to be very easy. Yes, it is true that they would use other means to increase the tariffs like Section 301 or 232. But can you use 232 or 301 to impose 50% tariff? I doubt. That is not going to be so easy because that will be preceded by probe. The probes itself should take time. And, let's understand the kind of window room that Trump has till now is only for a few months before the midterm comes in. Overall, if you look at it, United States was always known for clarity when it comes to trade issues, whether we like it or not. Today, that clarity, that uniformity has been replaced with arbitrariness, too much of discretionary power being used by the president. That has created a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos. Of course, countries like India would be very happy, as has been rightly mentioned, that for the next 5 months, you would have 10%. But 5 months later, they may have no option but to impose another 10% only, because you cannot anymore use tariff as a weapon or a sanction-creating tool or a replacement of sanctions as you have used. So I think that the verdict of Supreme Court creates a clear-cut red line. Of course, the discretionary powers of Trump administration or the US president in other ways of imposing tariffs will be there, but I don't think it will be to the extent of 30, 40, 50, whatever he feels like any morning. That creates a lot of financial and accounting problems as well. Imagine somebody buying something to sell to the American consumers. One day the tariff is 20%. Tomorrow he wakes up to realize it's 40%. And the day after it comes down to 30%. How much is he going to charge from the consumer? Right. Because every day he can't put in a new level.
No, absolutely. Absolutely, Pathakrit. For sure. No, I think you make a very, very valid point when you talk about the magnitude of these tariffs and how a precedent, legal as it may be, has been set in terms of, not being able to bring in these kind of numbers again. But Josh, if I could just quickly bring you in on this. Pathakrit there was mentioning the midterm elections as well. Surely, electorally, the fact that the Supreme Court, has struck down these tariffs could also mean, economists say, an average increase in household incomes to the tune of $1,000 owing to a consumption spike. And that should make sense for the Republicans. Despite having, the president's tariffs struck down, an average increase in household incomes, a boost to consumption, surely that means good news for the electoral, from an electoral perspective for the Republicans. So you'd reckon it isn't all bad news then for the administration?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's actually kind of a bit of a win-win for them. Look, if they got this passed through the Supreme Court, it would have been a hallmark move of his administration. But he always kind of knew that this was a risky play. In the end of the day, they'll get some tariffs pushed through. But as you said, these benefits to the consumer will definitely result in some kind of economic help going into the midterm elections. services, which I think was a really important point that you brought up. And I think that, the stock market already has been in a pretty good spot. And I think that consumer strength will increase that. And stock market does not like tariffs, right? So every time that kind of wild tariff comments come up, and particularly tariff uncertainty, markets don't like uncertainty, right? The stocks tend to sell off pretty hard. But now that there's more certainty on the tariff situation, maybe some of these savings get passed along to consumers. That is also stock positive. There is a litany of actually pretty positive effects for Republicans that come out of this decision. So I don't think that it's all bad for the administration at all. Trump is just likely to be dramatic about it to push his own political agenda and get his party motivated behind at least some incremental tariff passing, just to show that he was able to get it done.
Absolutely. Gaura, let me come to you before we end, and let you have the last word. You probably already guessed what my next question is going to be. Come Monday, how are markets going to react? Which sectors do you think would be the most buoyed, and how do you see it panning out really insofar as the near to medium term is concerned from a stock market perspective?
So I think export-oriented sectors that are more exposed to the US, they'll definitely rejoice. For example, textiles, gems and jewelry, those areas, they have really suffered. For example, gems and jewelry during the 50% bilateral tariff, which was from September, and we have data till December, they've actually seen a 60% decline in exports to US during that short window when we had that 50% bilateral tariff. Even textiles, apparels, footwear, if you see there's some 20% decline that those sectors have seen during that 50% bilateral window. So any export-oriented sector will definitely rejoice. I think even software services sectors, you will see a positive reaction because you see a US government that will not be able to use tariffs as a tool, as a main negotiating tool, whether they are using it on trade-related issues or they're using it for geopolitical issues. Their ability to freely wield tariffs has been taken away by the ruling. They can no longer use the Emergency Powers Act, which basically gave the president unrestrained ability to impose tariffs just by invoking that section. Now they can't go there. So you'll see an administration that will have to come up with other tools to use if they want to get, whatever they want another country to do, whether it's trade related or non-trade related. So export-oriented sectors will definitely do better, whether they are directly impacted or indirectly impacted like services. I think from the market's perspective, there could be definitely some relief for USD INR, but at the same time, we are facing some geopolitical tensions between US and Iran. So we'll have to look at that. There's a pickup in crude oil prices, so that is a little bit of a dampener for the INR, but near term, you'll see some positive knee-jerk reaction from the currency, for the currency market.
Right.
And whenever you have seen some positive development for the currency, even the fixed income market, you will see some temporary relief.
Right.
But subject to what happens on the geopolitical front.
Absolutely. So temporary relief can be, yes, no doubt, some temporary relief there, a possible upside for export-looking sectors. And what can I say? It's advantage negotiation, and that pretty much is perhaps the only apt way that the whole legal fallout of the Trump tariffs can be summarized. On that note, Pathakrit, Josh, Gaura, great having you with us on the Bulletin. Thanks so much for joining us and breaking down some of those insights.